HOA Karen hit me with $1 million fine, so I evicted the HOA from my land. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official looking. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was another one of those junk mail pieces designed to look important. But the return address caught my eye: Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I tore it open, standing in my driveway, still holding my coffee mug. As I read the first paragraph, the mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the concrete. Notice of violation and accumulated fines: $1,247,500, $1,247,500. My hands shook as I read further. According to HOA President Patricia Thorne, I had been in continuous violation of 17 different covenants for the past 5 years. Each violation carried a fine of $500 per day. The violations ranged from unauthorized exterior paint color to unapproved landscaping modifications to excessive vehicle parking. I lived on a 3-acre property at the end of Whispering Pines, a small development of 12 homes built 15 years ago. My house had been here longer than the development, built by my grandfather in 1967, long before any HOA existed, when a developer bought the surrounding land and built the other homes. My family had refused to sell. We'd been here first, and we intended to stay. The problem was that my property sat right at the entrance to the development. Every resident had to drive past my house to reach theirs. And Patricia had decided that my house, with its original 1960s ranch styling, my grandfather's old pickup truck in the driveway, and my vegetable garden in the front yard was an eyesore that lowered everyone's property values. I'd been receiving violation notices for 3 years, ever since Patricia became HOA president. I'd ignored them all, operating under the reasonable assumption that, since I wasn't part of the HOA and never signed any covenants, they had no authority over me. Apparently, I'd been wrong about that, or at least, Patricia thought I was wrong. I called my attorney, Stephen Park, the moment I got inside. "Stephen, they're saying I owe them over $1 million in HOA fines." There's a long pause. "You're not in the HOA, Daniel. You never signed their covenants." That's what I thought. "But this letter says I'm in continuous violation, and they're placing a lien on my property. They're threatening foreclosure. Email me that letter right now. Don't respond to them. Don't sign anything. I'll look into this immediately." 2 hours later, Stephen called back, and his voice was tight with anger. "Daniel, this is one of the most aggressive HOA overreach cases I've ever seen. Patricia Thorne filed a lawsuit 3 years ago, claiming that your property is technically part of the development because it shares the access road. She argued that you're receiving a benefit from HOA-maintained infrastructure, and therefore should be subject to their rules. That's insane. My grandfather built that access road in 1965. The HOA just repaved it. I know, and here's the worst part. She got a judgment in her favor. The case went through without you knowing, because the court notices were sent to an old address. There's a default judgment saying you're subject to HOA authority. My blood ran cold. How is that possible? It looks like she deliberately used an outdated address from old property records. The judge signed off without you having a chance to defend yourself. Now she's using that judgment to justify these astronomical fines. So what do? We appeal the judgment, obviously. But Daniel, there's something else you need to know. I pulled the property records going back to 1962. Your grandfather's original deed includes something very interesting, an easement clause. What kind of easement? The kind that might just solve your problem. Can you come to my office? I need to show you this in person." An hour later, I sat in Stephen's office, staring at faded documents spread across his desk. My grandfather's original property deed, dated 1962, showed that he'd owned not just 3 acres, but 17 acres. The entire area where Whispering Pines now stood. In 1989, your grandfather sold 14 acres to Oakmont Development Company, Stephen explained, running his finger along the text. But look at this clause in the sale agreement. I leaned forward. Reading seller retains perpetual easement rights over all access roads, common areas, and recreational facilities developed on the sole property. Any homeowners association form must obtain written consent from seller for exclusive use of common areas. "I don't understand," I said. "What does this mean?" Stephen smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who'd just found a winning hand. "It means your grandfather sold them the land, but he kept the rights to the roads and common areas. When the HOA was formed in 2009, they never got written consent from your family to take control of those areas. But your grandfather died in 2003, and you inherited all his property rights, including this easement. Daniel, you don't just own your 3 acres, you technically own the rights to every road, every sidewalk, every playground, and every clubhouse in Whispering Pines. The HOA has been operating on your land without your permission for 15 years. The implications slowly dawn on me. So, when Patricia says I'm benefiting from their roads, she's got it backwards. They've been benefiting from your roads. Roads your grandfather built and maintained for decades before selling the land. Roads you still have legal rights to." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. What can we do with this? We can do a lot. But first, let's talk about what I'd like to do. Stephen pulled out a legal pad. "I want to file a motion to vacate that fraudulent judgment. Then I want to sue Patricia Thorne personally for abuse of process." And then he paused for effect. "I want to send the HOA a formal notice that they're operating on your property without permission. And you're revoking their access, unless they meet certain conditions." "What conditions?" "Whatever you want. But I'd suggest drop all fines against you, issue a formal apology, and resign from the HOA board. Patricia Thorne has abused her position, and it's time for consequences." "Can we actually do this?" "Daniel, you can evict the entire HOA from your land if you want to. They have no legal leg to stand on." The next week, Stephen filed our motions and sent a formal letter to the HOA board. The letter was a masterpiece of legal writing detailing exactly how the easement worked and what it meant for the HOA's operations. The key points were simple. Daniel Vance held perpetual easement rights to all roads and common areas in Whispering Pines. The HOA had never obtained the required written consent to operate exclusively on these areas. Effective immediately, the HOA was operating without authorization. Daniel Vance was prepared to install gates and revoke access unless terms were met. The response was immediate and explosive. Patricia called me directly, her voice shaking with rage. "This is extortion. You can't threaten to cut off access to people's homes." "Actually, Patricia, I can. Those are my roads. My grandfather built them. He never had permission to take them over. The HOA has maintained those roads for 15 years, and I've maintained my property for 58 years. But that didn't stop you from trying to find me $1 million for it. This is insane." "You're insane? I'll have you arrested." "For what?" "Enforcing my property rights. The same rights you claim to be enforcing against me." I kept my voice calm, which seemed to infuriate her more. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia. You're going to call an emergency HOA meeting. You're going to present my attorney's letter to the board. And you're going to let them decide whether your personal vendetta against me is worth more than their ability to access their homes. She hung up without another word. The emergency meeting was scheduled for Saturday at the community clubhouse, a building that, technically, sat on land I had easement rights to. Stephen advised me not to attend, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to see Patricia's face when her carefully constructed authority crumbled. I arrived early and sat in the back row. The clubhouse filled quickly with confused and angry residents who received Lachey's urgent notices about a property access crisis. Patricia stood at the front with the other board members, her expression grim. She started the meeting by trying to spin the situation as me being a difficult neighbor who was holding the community hostage. But Stephen had prepared for this. He'd sent copies of all the relevant documents to every homeowner in advance. A man named Michael Lawson stood up, holding the documents. Patricia, I'm a real estate attorney. I've reviewed these papers. Mr. Vance is absolutely correct. The original easement was never properly transferred. Legally, he has every right to control access to common areas. This is a technicality, Patricia snapped. No, another woman said, standing. This is you trying to steal someone's property rights. Because you don't like how his house looks, I've seen those violation notices you've been sending him. 17 violations. For what? Having a garden, parking his truck. You've been harassing this man for years. More residents stood up, and suddenly Patricia was facing a revolt from her own community. You filed a lawsuit using a fake address to prevent him from defending himself. Someone called out, "That's fraud." You're trying to foreclose on a house that's been in his family for 60 years. All because you think his vegetable garden is an eyesore. Patricia's face turned bright red. Everything I've done has been to protect our property values. That house is bringing down the entire neighborhood. No, I said, standing up. Everyone turned to look at me. What's bringing down this neighborhood is having an HOA president who abuses her power, manufactures violations, and tries to steal people's homes because of a personal grudge. The room erupted in applause. Patricia looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. The vote was unanimous. Patricia Thorne was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The board agreed to drop all fines against me, issue a formal written apology, and reform their violation policies. In exchange, I agreed to grant them proper easement rights to the common areas, with specific clauses protecting my property from future harassment. But that wasn't the end. Stephen's investigation into the fraudulent lawsuit uncovered that Patricia had falsified documents and knowingly used an incorrect address to prevent me from receiving notice. She was sued personally for abuse of process, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case settled out of court. Patricia paid $47,000 in damages and legal fees, resigned from the HOA entirely, and sold her house within 3 months. I never saw her again. The new HOA president, Michael Lawson, came to my house a week after Patricia left. He brought a bottle of wine and a handwritten apology on behalf of the community. I want you to know that most of us never supported what Patricia was doing, he said as we sat on my porch. We thought the violation notices were legitimate HOA business. We didn't realize she was manufacturing them out of spite. I appreciate that, I said. Your house doesn't bring down property values, by the way. I've looked at the comps. If anything, having one of the original homes from the 1960s adds character to the neighborhood. Patricia was just. He trailed off. A bully with a clipboard, I finished. He laughed. Exactly. We've reformed the whole violation system. From now on, any violation has to be approved by 3 board members, not just the president. And we're going to focus on real issues, not personal vendettas. That sounds like a good change. Oh, and one more thing. He pulled out a document. We'd like to formally grant you an honorary membership in the HOA. No fees, no obligations. Just a symbolic gesture that you're part of this community and always have been. I took the document and smiled. On one condition. What's that? I get to keep my vegetable garden. Michael grinned. I think we can manage that. 3 months later, I stood in my front yard, tending to my tomatoes and zucchini. The garden was bigger now, sprawling across half the lawn. No one had complained. In fact, several neighbors had asked for gardening advice. My grandfather's old pickup truck still sat in the driveway, but now it had company. Michael's classic Mustang was often parked next to it when he came by for weekend chats. The house was still painted the original 1960s color scheme, and it would stay that way. The access road, my access road, technically, had been repaved with money from the HOA budget, but this time with my permission and input. They'd even installed a small plaque at the entrance. Original road built by George Vance, 1965. As I watered my tomatoes that afternoon, I thought about the $1 million fine that had started this whole mess. Patricia had tried to use inflated authority and manufactured violations to force me out of my own home. Instead, she lost everything. Her position, her credibility, her money, and eventually her house. The lesson was simple. Authority without legitimacy is just bullying. And bullies tend to be very surprised when their victims fight back with actual facts and actual rights. I picked the right tomato, warm from the sun, and took a bite. It tasted like victory, and it tasted like home.